Hello, this is Glen Lennox.
A lot of things when growing up as an African-American female, growing up in the 60s and the 70s, in rural North Carolina, there are a lot of things that you accept. There are things that are happening, they're not right, they're wrong. You don't know how to change them. You don't have the power to change them. And so you're taught to handle things a certain way. I was educated, as I mentioned before, in Wisconsin. So I've been in a dual society of blacks and whites and understanding things and growing to understand how to change things and the best way to make change happen positively. And most times that's with a calm voice. Most times that's with thinking about it first before you act. And it's a lot about listening to people.
Today, we're speaking with Delores Bailey, Executive Director for the Community Development Corporation Empowerment and Chair for the Glen Lennox Redevelopment Committee. In 2009, Delores was invited to take part in the redevelopment process, partly due to her background in community growth, but also because of her personal connection to the neighborhood. In 2021, Delores was named Hometown Hero by Chapelboro News for her effort in strengthening neighborhoods and advocating for affordable housing in Chapel Hill. Join us for another episode of Hello, Glen Lennox, as Delores emphasizes the value of active listening and establishing genuine trust with residents invested in the redevelopment process.
I actually came to empowerment through a really long kind of process of life having just been in a cycle. I grew up in a community just across the street from where Glen Lennox is. I grew up in the Barbies Chapel community, which is why the Glen Lennox piece, when it became important to the town of Chapel Hill, it was important to me because I had grown up around the Glen Lennox area. We grew up in Barbies Chapel. Jordan Lake was built. Our community had to be moved. It was taken over by eminent domain. And my family moved to Chapel Hill, to Graham Street, which is where we live now. Several years later, I'd gone away to school, came back to Chapel Hill, back again on Graham Street, and 9/11 happened. And just after 9/11, I was invited by the then executive director, Mark Chilton, to be a part of Empowerment, a nonprofit that was working in the traditionally African-American neighborhoods of Chapel Hill and Carborough. I took the position of community organizer. I went from community organizer to rental property manager to assistant director to director of Empowerment. I started in 2002 at Empowerment, and in 2005, I became the executive director of Empowerment Incorporated. That's how I got here. So it wasn't so much the quickness of my rise as everything that was happening during that time of my life and the time of empowerment were duplicating each other. When I was growing up in Barbies Chapel community and we had to leave because of eminent domain, by the time we came to Chapel Hill in around 2001, 2002, there was a lot of changing going on in our neighborhood, in the neighborhood that I had grown up in since the 70s. It all evolved, and it involved the community. It was really sort of the same kind of thing. Investors were starting to take over the community, which was very similar to what happened when I was growing up, and the government, by eminent domain, took over our community there. So it was really life duplicating itself. And because Empowerment's goal was to work with community and help strengthen community, that was something that I had always grown up with in the Barbies Chapel community, was community helping each other. So I came in as a community organizing, but I knew the neighborhood that was trying to better itself. I lived in that neighborhood. So it was not really that I rose so quickly. It was more I was able to take all of the things I had learned in life. I went away to school in Wisconsin. I lived in Colorado. I lived in Atlanta. By the time I came back to Chapel Hill in the 2000s, I was able to take all of the things I had learned about community and about using my voice and about helping community to grow and apply it to the Northside community. And the position at Empowerment just gave me an opportunity to pull together all of those things I had learned and help grow my community. It just happened to be the best thing to, the culmination of all of the things that I knew how to do really well. So from 2002 to 2005, I was learning and understanding delay. I hadn't intended to be the director. I really had intended to work for Empowerment for a couple of years, get back out there in the real world and start making my money and helping raise my family. But I ended up at Empowerment and started learning and loving it and realizing there were some things I thought I could bring to Empowerment to help not only the Northside community, not only the African American community, not only the low wealth communities of Orange County, but all of Orange County. And so it wasn't really the time, it was just being able to put together the things I had learned and place them in the places that needed that attention. And as I have matured in the position of Executive Director of Empowerment, you're right, there are several hurtful things that we have come through. There have been several times when we have been ignored out of a situation or not included in a situation when we should have been at the table. And one of my favorite things about the play Hamilton is, not being invited in the back room. There have been several of those times that Empowerment has had to struggle, but ultimately we seem to win. And so I just take what we got and what I'm handed, try to look at it thoughtfully and in the most positive light and see how we can win and how more than one person can win, how a community can win. Because what I realize is that people are acting out of emotions, especially now, especially since we've come through the Donald Trump era, especially since we've come through COVID. People are acting out of emotions and they may not know what to do with those emotions. It really is about continuing to build community and just meeting people where they are.
I became involved with the redevelopment because I heard the name Glen Lennox, and that was home to me. So that was my initial involvement with the whole redevelopment piece of it, was hearing about it at first, and then actually being asked to be engaged in creating the Glen Lennox Conservation District, because we had done that for the Northside community. So full circle, I grew up knowing about Glen Lennox, shopping in Glen Lennox, that kind of thing. And then back in, as far as I can show my records, around 2009 is when we became reacquainted with Grub Properties as that relates to the Glen Lennox development. My first connection with Glen Lennox was on a personal level, in that I grew up in that area. But around 2008, 2009, I was invited by town council and also by some of the residents living in Glen Lennox community to sit in with them as they talked with Grub Properties about the future for Glen Lennox. And at that time, it was a really scary kind of conversation for the residents living at Glen Lennox, because they had lived at Glen Lennox for so long. Glen Lennox was a very, very beloved spot for the Chapel Hill community as well, and particularly for the University Committee, because many of their grad students raised their families in and around Glen Lennox. And it was one of a true staple community of Chapel Hill. So when I was invited around 2008, 2009, it was about how to best preserve the qualities of Glen Lennox. And that was the cultural piece of Glen Lennox, as well as the affordability of Glen Lennox. Empowerment had helped a few other communities create something called the Conservation District. And that was the one piece. It was a zoning tool that the town used to protect older neighborhoods, and Glen Lennox was one of the older neighborhoods. And one of the things that came out about Glen Lennox, was in the paper first before anyone had a chance to talk about it, was what Grub Properties was going to do in Glen Lennox, and how it was going to be this wonderful place to live, and it was going to be modern, and it was going to be great. And I'll admit that the Grub Properties folk came on board ready to listen. We had a series of meetings, and a lot of that was about how to help current residents understand what they were trying to do with the redevelopment, understand how they were going to do it. And I know that when Grub Properties first started in 2007, 2008, by 2010, they had changed some of the redevelopments so that they were being responsive to the residents of the Glen Lennox community, which we absolutely appreciated. We did create a conservation district for the Glen Lennox area, and I think that was I know it was with the input of Grub Properties. So I don't know all of the specific details as the project progressed to where it is today, but I do know they were able to work with longtime residents of Glen Lennox and make concessions to them for people who had lived there a long time and wanted to continue to live there. And I'm sure you've talked to Robert Dowling about the master leasing piece that they included in the Glen Lennox redevelopment, which was a very nice piece, helped a lot of people who normally wouldn't have had and could not have secured housing, rental housing, with the minimal funding that they had. And so most recently was the opening of the Gwendolyn, which was a very beautiful building and absolutely honors the African-American female student from UNC, which is a good thing. I have watched that project and the redevelopment of it come to life. And as I mentioned before, I've been involved in it from 2009 to 2021, which I think is when they opened the Gwendolyn. I'm almost positive, it might have been 22. I've watched the program grow. I would say a few lessons learned from the entire Glen Lennox Properties redevelopment piece. I absolutely, because my background is community organizing, I will always be on the side of the residents and listening to the residents and their concern. And I think at the very beginning, a little bit of hesitation. I think the Grub Property folk were also a little apprehensive about working with the residents. And I think that's what happens when you've got planners / developers working with neighborhoods. But I will always stand on the right and fight for, as Grub did, working with the current residents to make a project happen. I think the most important thing you can do, any developer, investor, contractor can do, is gain the trust and respect of the neighborhood. And I believe some of the stipulations Grub Property put into the redevelopment absolutely spoke to the hearts of the current residents at that time. And that makes all the difference in the world, particularly because there were so many moving parts in this. I can't stress enough how Glen Lennox was a residential community. And so what the redevelopment was calling for was not just the redevelopment. To put buildings there meant that some housing had to go. And I think that Grub Properties worked very hard to try to compensate for the housing that they were going to take away. And I think they probably did a good job of that. But it will always be important, and I appreciate the redevelopment considered the feelings of the residents that were living in Glen Lennox at that time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Hello Glen Lennox, a series we've created to explore the rich history of the beloved Chapel Hill neighborhood and the important role it played in the forming of the town we know today. To listen to other Hello Glen Lennox episodes, or to see what's new in the neighborhood, click the What's Happening link at glenlennoxvision.com.